Welcome, fellow tanks, to another Vox Immortalis Commentary Tank Guide. My name is Coldam. This video is for the I Choose You Steelbreaker achievement, the hard mode for the Iron Council fight. Our setup for this fight is a warrior tank for Mulgim and Brundir, and a protection paladin who stays on Steelbreaker. Because of our raid setup, our paladin's the only person who can dispel the fusion punch debuff from Steelbreaker. So this is kind of a default setup. As a warrior, though, you're very good for taking these two guys, simply because you can interrupt chain lightnings, as well as stun, of course, fairly frequently. On the pole, as a warrior, if you're trying to keep Brundir from casting anything and get the achievement for keeping him interrupted, you can use your throw on Mulgim as you rush in, and then quickly charge to Brundir. And even if he immediately started chain lightning, once you aggroed, you'll quickly charge him and interrupt his cast, and then you'll be in range to shield bash and stun from there. Positioning is pretty important for this tank. In fact, that's the majority of the fight in terms of damage. So make sure you know where you can stand so that your ranged DPS especially are able to get in Rune of Power. You can also shield slam the Shield of Runes that Mulgim has to dispel it, or if you have a mage or shaman or similar, they can spell steel, purge, that kind of thing. The damage intake from this particular set of mobs is very weak from Brundir, but Mulgim does decent damage. It can be spiky, especially when the Rune of Power just comes up. There's those few seconds where they're going to have the debuff, or excuse me, the buff. One thing you can do is, as you see here, you can position the mobs such that they're in melee range of the Rune of Power, but they themselves are not within the power itself. And this will allow your melee DPS to get the 50% bonus. Make sure you avoid overloads, even though a tank can survive it fairly easily. It's just more damage than it needs to be healed. Once Brundir dies, positioning again is key. We try to take advantage of any runes of power up because you have a short delay until Mulgim starts using runes of death. One thing you can do here also is, once Mulgim is about to use Rune of Death, instruct your raid to stay spread out and not jump right into the Rune of Power. And this basically will keep the Rune of Death from stacking up on top of the Rune of Power. Another thing you can do as the Mulgim tank, if you're a warrior or a druid and you don't have one of those on Steelbreaker, you can get in range of Demo Shout to Demo Shout Steelbreaker, and that will just lower the damage a bit on your main tank there. So as you can see here, move Mulgim quickly away from that first rune, and that way if he chooses you or a melee to cast Rune of Death, as he just did there, it won't stack up on top of the Rune of Power. And at that point, drag Mulgim back in range here. If you're tanking Steelbreaker during this phase, it's important, of course, to make sure you know when Rune of Power is about to be cast, and watch to see if it's under Steelbreaker. You can even be proactive, and if you have focus on Mulgim, when you see him casting Rune of Power, just start moving Steelbreaker from his current position. And that way, even if he chooses Steelbreaker, you'll already be moving out of it. At this point, the transition is very important for tanking. Because our Paladin's the only one that can dispel Fusion Punch, as mentioned, as a warrior, I run over before Mulgrim dies, and after a recent Fusion Punch, announce to the raid that I'm tanking. So I quickly taunt and start tanking. And this is basically just to ensure that I'm the first person to get overwhelming power, rather than our Paladin tank, since he can dispel me from Fusion Punch, and then when I die, he can take over and continue dispelling himself. The added benefit also is that he's guaranteed to be the second highest threat, so he doesn't have to taunt off me when I'm about to die. He can just completely wait for me to die from Meltdown, and Steelbreaker will automatically switch to him. Obviously, Steelbreaker's damage is hugely increased at this point on your tanks, so healers of course need to be aware of that, but as a tank, try to make sure you're doing everything you can to mitigate your damage. Unfortunately, the big spike is Fusion Punch, which is not really physical, but he still hits pretty hard. And since you get the 200% damage increase, you can actually do some decent damage. Save your cooldowns and spam your abilities. As you can see there, when I drop, we had our melee back out just a couple seconds before that, just to make sure they weren't in the AE range. And if you have Soulstone, as we do here, you can put it on your first tank so you know you'll have another tank. In this particular case, this was our first kill of this achievement, and our damage was plenty high enough that we weren't anywhere near needing a second tank again, but it's good to be safe. And hope that helps. Thanks for watching.